forget. I believe that we have Jennifer from Flow, and she had to step away, so she'll be right back.
Oh no, I'm here, Marnie.
Oh, Ethan, oh, I didn't see you there. Okay, great.
Jenny might have gotten sent to another room, but
She sure did.
we're interchangeable.
All right, so we are all good. Are there, let's start with questions. Are there any questions? Let's make sure we're very clear on what these options are. I'll share my screen. And do we have a note taker in this room? Nobody's raising their hand.
Don't think so, Marnie.
Okay. And I am going to do that. All right. So, questions, Jonathan.
Wait, how do you do that?
Okay, so my question is about, it's not shown on this map, but in one of the G series, there's a Northeast, I'm a Glencoe rep, and there's a section of Northeast Glencoe feeder, which is going to Vestal for elementary school, and then from Vestal on to Harrison Park. But if I was we're south of this is like north of Gleason, I believe. So you're really, really close to Mount Tabor, middle school, right? I mean, like proximity wise. So I, of course, understand that like the schools are located where they're located, you know, some people are going to be closer to school and some people are going to be further away from the school. But I can understand how going from like closest to Mount Tabor to basically furthest away from the middle school would be frustrating for parents. So I guess and this is a weird question, but has there been thought to, and maybe it's even too late, but like could that section of Glencoe, which will then go to Vestal and then Harrison Park, could they go to Vestal and then to Mount Tabor? Or is that too flippy floppy? Because I feel like because it would do a couple of things from the metric standpoint too, right? If we're talking about like average distance from home to middle school, that would decrease the overall distance to middle school by allowing those students to go to Mount Tabor because it's much closer.
I can try to take a stab sort of at answering that. That area has been, it exists, you know, partly to help shore up Vestal's enrollment. Vestal is very unenrolled. And, you know, we've also been throughout the process struggling with enrollment at Harrison Park. I think that and somebody maybe from the group chime in too, but there have been examinations of split feeders, and I don't think the district has said that they're completely off the table, but I think that's more for some of the SEGC to comment on.
I guess the one other thing I would add to that is that if I'm not mistaken, the Mount Tabor is predicted to have like a 63 or 64% utilization, and Harrison Park has like a 67% utilization under these changes. So that, again, it adds an extra layer of complication by having kids go to an elementary school, that most of which feeds to one middle school, and instead of feeding to another middle school. But I guess my thought is like half of the kids at the middle school are from a different school anyways. So anyway, just a thought. I guess what the thought is that if I was a parent who lived in that area, the going to Vestal makes sense, but the going to Harrison Park doesn't make sense from like a logical standpoint, distance and that kind of stuff. So making that change, I think, is a way to get people who are not happy about the proposed changes to be at least okay, if not accept the change, like be more positive about them.
Margaret just joined us as our PPS rep. She missed that question. How do you feel, Jonathan?
Sorry, one more time.
How do you feel about the answer? Do you want more information from Margaret Calvert, who just joined
Well,
us?
I mean, I guess, I don't want to bogart all the time here. I know we're limited, but I guess, is that something that could be added? Is it too late to add that? Should I have brought this up months ago?
So I'm sorry, I don't know what is. So if you could just
Yeah, I'll try
step
and,
back a little bit further, that will help me. Thank you.
yeah, sure. I'll try and be concise.
Uh-oh.
Harrison Park, but they're very close. Some of the parents that they're upset about, I can see Mount Tabor Middle School, but my kids are going to go to Harrison Park. Like there's maybe some conflicting feelings about switching from Glencoe to Vestal, but going to Harrison Park, where there'd be the furthest kids from Harrison Park as opposed to some of the closest kids to Mount Tabor, is there an opportunity to continue to send those kids to Vestal for elementary school, but then to Mount Tabor for middle school?
So I think one of the things we want to have as a little bit of a backdrop, I think, Jonathan, is to say if there are spaces, I think we need to note it, right, and just say, okay, here is as we're looking at these, right. I think to the discussion we had just prior is like, if there's specific things like with these that we want to say, hey, is that possible? I think we just need to get them in writing and say, can we look at this? So I think that's really, Jonathan, like, as we're going through and having this discussion of looking at these two, one of the things we really want to surface is, hey, as we're looking at this looks like it's there's a benefit to this particular thing. We just want to make sure that we're recorded in enough detail to say, what is that? Is that possible? So I guess that's a long answer to a short question, perhaps. So I think it's about the specificity of what you're saying and what are we saying the benefits of that will be helpful. And I think that anyway, that's what I'd say at this point.
You're muted, Jonathan. Jonathan, you're muted. Jonathan, you're muted and you're talking.
I've been in one of these meetings before. Sorry. Still muted?
It says you're muted, but I can hear you now. There you go. And now I think maybe you're frozen. Okay. So we have about 20 minutes. We're going to check in 20 minutes. So let's make sure we get any questions out first about these two, about G1, G2, there, because we have Ethan here and we have Margaret to answer questions before then we start to make sure we have the concerns listed. Alyssa.
Thank you. Ethan, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the equity differences. You mentioned that I think you said G2 looked better than G1, but it was and then I liked how you flipped, but then I was like having a hard time following that too. So I don't know if you could maybe slowly go over that.
Yeah, sure. And I agree, the flip's helpful, but also jarring or confusing. I wouldn't say that G2 is better. Well, it's better in some aspects. There's that comment there, results a bit better centered for centered students in G2. And that's just kind of purely talking about percentage of students in schools with a utilization greater than 80%. And again, we're thinking that we want that to be low. And part of the reason why this is that there are, I believe in G1, Kellogg is at something like 83%. So by our, very cold and calculating cutoff metric, that runs through the model, you know, that does affect things. So it doesn't, I think from the summary stats, it's not very much highly utilized, but it does then kind of push that a little bit higher. It is still good to keep in mind that both of them were significantly lower than the amount of students who are in overutilized schools in the 2021 baseline. So does that answer your questions, or are there any other stats you'd like me to kind of go over in specific?
I guess maybe could you talk about the Black and Native American students and maybe the, because it looks like in both of the G proposals, we're actually dropping for everybody to be in a school greater than 500. But maybe if you could just explain that a little bit further. I'm not sure that I have a question, but.
Yes, so, and this kind of actually, I had to spend a second to think about this too, because the way that the metrics are worded and the way that the metrics work are slightly confusing. Within the baseline right now, we do have a lot of students in schools above 500 enrollment, which we think of from what we've been trying to think of is really good, but it's actually that they're way over 500 and therefore they're overutilized. So it's a little, we see that there is that really high 75% with Black and Native American students over in schools with enrollments, percentages of middle school students in schools higher than 500. But that dropping is actually kind of a reflection of what the inverse we see with utilization. So when we see both of those, the utilization being very high and the students in schools above 500 being high, that's kind of an indicator that things haven't improved. When both of those drop, especially utilization, we are able, that kind of is an indicator that things are improved. And again, keeping in mind that if it's above 80% utilization, those students that are within that school above 80% utilization. So for instance, in G1, where we have Kellogg, slightly above 80% utilization, all of those students in Kellogg are going to count against that percentage. So it's a little bit lower. So it partly has to do with, yeah, just really grokking exactly what the percentages we're measuring are and what numbers are driving what. So.
Does that make sense to everyone?
Good.
Okay, Micah.
Yeah, Ethan, thanks for clarifying that. And that was one of my, I guess, questions or comment to Alyssa too, in terms of, you know, looking at these percentages, even from the very beginning, right? Because it seems like what's more important, the 500 to 270 or utilization, right? Because I know some of them, I mean, some you get over way 500 and it's the utilization, depending on the building size, it still could be very low, right? And to me, I feel that the priority would be getting every school, regardless of utilization, to 500 and 270, unless I'm totally wrong on that. Right? So in that case, I think G1 is better because all the schools are, at least middle schools, are above 500 except for Mount Tabor. Wait, is that correct?
Yeah, and yes,
right.
And within, we also can't forget that within this metric, technically Roseway Heights is calculated here. So we're you know, that's always factoring into things.
Right, and there may be a plan for Mount Tabor and Roseway Heights when the balance is going on in the Northeast, possibly, right? So that was my 2 cents in terms of when I'm looking at these, I look at the 500 and 270 more than utilization.
Margaret, would you comment on that? Does that
So I think, you know, the utilization is a little bit of a, it's a tricky one because it's like the opposite, right? It flows, it cuts counter to everything else that we're looking at. And so I think when you're looking, I'm flipping back and forth between G1 and G2. And I'm seeing right now, right, like that in G2, for example, Hosford and Roseway Heights are under the 500 threshold. The Hosford's at 583, but it's pretty close, right? And then in G1, we see that it is, you know, that Mount Tabor and Roseway Heights are both under, right? So I think that there is a little bit of, you know, which is what will it flow through which school? I think probably the biggest thing overall is that you know, as we're going through and you make this adjustment from a K-8 to an elementary and then a middle grades, it's going to affect utilization just from making that change, right? And so I just want to acknowledge that like when you have a school that right now you have, you know, a K-8, they're not in, you know, so that it affects that metric. So just making the change to a middle school is going to shift some of those pieces. So I just want to make sure that I think really the bigger thing is moving Harrison Park to making that into the middle school is what is driving this probably more than anything. I think when we look at Northeast and North, like the timing, I think Judy did a pretty nice job of saying, you know, we're going to be looking at middle school redesign pieces in the as we move forward. We're going to be looking at high school enrollment, and these are going to be cascading and iterative. They're going to be cascading processes, I guess, is what I would say. And so it's very hard to make a decision for this particular situation about what could happen in the future because we don't have the timeline really laid out for all those things all at once. So I think that the notion of can you get to the numbers that we're using as metrics within this time frame, and then the rest of it is going to be some uncertainty that just we won't have enough information really to make a decision in this particular process. But what we learn from this process will inform ensuing processes. So I just I do think that, you know, Esther spoke to this a little bit earlier this evening. I think that the conversations that have been had over this period of time will be informing. And so I think that has been very helpful to be part of and to listen to all the things that the group is wrestling with. And what's starting to surface is sort of decision points for you guys. So I just want to thank you for that. Mike, I hope that's helpful, but if it's not, I can say more or answer a slightly different question.
Thumbs up from Micah. Okay, from Micah to Maya.
Hi, that kind of answered my question, but I guess this is directed to Margaret too. Looking at G1, you know, the forecast for Mount Tabor is 427. Is that concerning to you, or should that be concerning, or do you feel with future like anticipated Northeast balancing that that's not really something to worry about?
I think as we go through, the goal will be to, I think ultimately, you know, get as close as we can to the metrics as possible in a broad space. I think the question of, you know, we're going to go back to the discussion of, is there a, you know, robust programming, which we've laid out as kind of two things. One, which was around the types of art programs that were there, like sort of what that looked like, and the electives that go with, you know, there was an art elective discussion about robustness and then about the breadth of what the program would look like for students. So there are a couple of things that that will feed into that, and one is the size of the student body. And I think that, of course, we're going to we'd be interested in getting as close to 500 as possible would be the goal. And then the question is, I do think that, as I said, that this is going to inform sort of a next wave of decisions. And so I think that, I think that this will probably, Mount Tabor is an example of a school that is going to be something that we look at a couple of times here, right? So is it concerning? It's not, it's in the realm of where we would like to see things, but like, can we get it closer in this moment? I think would be the question. And then how does that play out ultimately? I mean, I think that's something to consider, but certainly we've set a metric and it's not at that metric right now, right?
So we are just a little bit over half of the time we have in this small group. Are there more questions, or do any of you have strong feelings that you'd like to process over G1 over G2 or G2 over G1? Do any of these either of these stand out to you as the clear, better option?
I don't know, we have Bridger neighborhood and Atkinson rep here. I just like to hear from them because this kind of affects those two and Glencoe, but Jonathan spoke. So I just like to hear from those folks if they're here.
And from Bridger, I don't want to presume to speak for Bridger on this because we definitely haven't. It's not something that we've discussed as a community. I mean, my personal reaction is, I like the fact that G2 kind of, I think essentially G1, we named that Tabor's kind of low, Kellogg's still a little high, G2 kind of fixes that. I personally think that it does a better job of balancing things a little bit. And then I think I slightly prefer the result we get with the way we're handling the K5s and G2 as well in that South Tabor area. But mostly I just think the big difference is on the extent to which it balances middle schools. And I think G2 does a little bit better job. That's just my personal take though, not speaking for anyone else.
Andy, can you say just a little bit more about what you're seeing in the K5s? Because
well, I should pull up the number as well. I think the dividing, I think what I personally think is a little bit more elegant is using, I forget what street is. We try to use like more of an actual sort of major street as the dividing line there versus Woodward, which we've gotten feedback that feels a little bit arbitrary. So I don't know if it makes a significant difference with the numbers, but I think if one of the things we were trying to achieve was similar to what we've been able to do in some other neighborhoods, trying to peg the boundaries to actual kind of slightly more major streets, that does a better job. But you're right, it still splits at the same number of ways. Yeah. So
yep. No, I appreciate that clarification. Thanks.
Anyone else leaning toward one over the other? Jonathan said he prefers G1. The utilization of Mount Tabor is much higher in G2 compared to G1.
I don't know if it helps anyone, but I do want to point out that area of southern part of Glencoe, between G1 and G2, they could go either way, as in the way that it's presented in G2 could be applied to G1. It just wouldn't that northern part wouldn't get sent to Atkinson. It would just get sent to, or it'd stay at Glencoe. Off the top of my head, I couldn't say exactly what that would do to the numbers, although it would increase, you'd be keeping more students at Mount Tabor, but you'd also theoretically be taking those students away from Hosford. So whether that then dips Hosford too far below, I can't say right now, but if that is a thing that people want to consider, I think that's a possible solution.
Well, G1 has Mount Tabor at 427, and then G2 has Hosford at 483. So, I mean, yeah, I see Hosford at least being closer to 500 than Mount Tabor being way below. I mean, just from a numbers perspective.
And G2, it's at 85% utilization, but it's still a big improvement from, I think right now it's way even more overcrowded right now, I think, right? So I guess it depends sort of whether it's not ideal in either, right? But is it better to have it significantly under or a little over? Not ideal in either though.
Does anyone else have ideas about these? We're talking about whether we stay in here a little bit longer, but we are coming kind of to the end. How about someone we haven't heard from? Does anyone have strong feelings that, oh my gosh, absolutely not that one? You're unmuted, Sandra. Oh, you just muted yourself.
I was trying to decide whether or not I was going to say something. I just had a concern that's sort of adjacent to our conversation. If we're selecting between the G proposals tonight, and the next week we're comparing, the next meeting we're comparing F and G, that doesn't leave any time to talk about any nuancing of the G proposal that we prefer. And that just occurred to me at this moment, and it's a bit disconcerting.
So I'll speak, this is Megan. So at the end of the meeting, we're going to talk in going through G and then also F. We're going to give time. We have 3 weeks, I think, technically until our next meeting. So if people did want to give like feedback for like an amendment per se, we're going to give to the 15th to get to flow so they could turn it around and see if there's any additional amendments. So there will be a point of if you see things that are in G that could maybe affect, and you can add that to F or however that works. But we will give, time for that, especially being able to have 3 weeks in between meetings, if that's helpful in an answer.
That's extremely helpful. Thank you, Megan.
How about something that you could take from one to the other that would make it perfect? Is there something standing out? I know, not perfect, but better. How could we get one of them better? Is there anything that are you looking at G1 saying, oh, if only it had this? Are there nuances there?
Since we're not very talkative tonight, I'll just ask something or throw something out there. I'm having a hard time because we're just looking at this map and not looking at other things, but I can't find, like, on my other computer, I can't find everything. But on G1,
would you like to look at a different?
No, well, no, actually I want what we just had. So sorry about that. But on G1, I think I like how there's the section that gets assigned in whole from Bridger to Atkinson, but I'm not sure. It was interesting that Andy is a fan of G2, and I feel like you're more familiar. So I guess I'm wondering, what is the downside of that? Does it under enroll Marysville and Arleta maybe? Because otherwise it seems nice to keep that neighborhood section that's not going to get to go to creative science together, to move them together instead of splitting those people into two. So I would like to hear why that's not a great idea.
From a number standpoint with our flow folks, or are you asking Andy?
Just anyone. Like, what is the what are the ramifications, I guess, of doing that? Because it seems like that would be a good idea to me, but then is it just too many downstream effects of doing it, and that's the problem?
I just feel like it leads to like a slightly less, you're still I forget what Kellogg's at in G1, but I want to say it's still, or maybe Ethan can look it up or can remind me while we're talking. But I think to me, the result of the middle school enrollment still feels a little bit less balanced.
G1, Kellogg in G1 the total is 652 in 2025. Yeah, 652.
Which is,
and that's also keeping in mind that, so one of the things that strikes me in G2 is that Marysville has an enrollment of 3 something, really quick, wrong spreadsheet, 355. So it's got a pretty high enrollment, and it's a larger building. So I think it can hold a little bit more, but there will be students coming in in this scenario, there will be students coming in from Lent in Marysville, which are not modeled in either of these. So you could assume some amount greater than that for Marysville enrollment.
And that's one reason I think that if I remember correctly, that's one reason that actually, in addition to that line we picked as sort of an actual major street like that leaves room there to accommodate that, which was, I think, kind of elegant, even though I think you're right, Alyssa, the downside is you're dividing the neighborhood in some way.
Sandra?
I was just going to say for that the 355 number for 2025 puts Marysville at 66.6% utilization because there is a noted capacity of 533.
So we do have another 9 minutes.
Okay, so I don't want to be divisive, but I do just want to kind of put it on record that when we were looking at all of this, it's just struck me so many times in the process that this would be a lot easier if there weren't huge, predominantly white privileged areas that were not accessible for moving numbers around. And that's just, it's hard to overlook that.
Thank you, Maya.
Like that's a proposition that would, if we can get consensus on anything, that we get consensus on it. But I guess nothing we can do about it.
And I appreciate you bringing that in here.
There's a question from Beth Brett about in G1's enrollment for Arleta, which is just right below 270. I think it's like 263 in G1. And just to address the question in the chat, I think that there are ways you could extend the boundary. In G1, Kellogg or Creston has plenty of students. So you could move the boundary, that CRAR02 boundary could be pushed a little further west. I don't know exactly the makeup of the neighborhood in terms of streets. I mean, 52nd's an obvious choice there, but that would increase enrollment and probably wouldn't drop Creston below 270.
That divider, Ethan, is 62nd, and that street is between Foster and Powell. 62nd is a smaller street. So, I mean, that's a feasible option.
Go ahead, Sandra.
Well, there was a mention of, and maybe not in our small group here, but in the main group before and in some of the materials we got about the opt-out students from Lent DLI program who'd be attending Marysville and then passing on to Harrison Park for middle school, and creating a split feeder at that level. I think I'd be more in support of them being able to continue to Kellogg. And I think there were 85 or so students that Megan, or 87, something like that. It's still, I guess, technically a split because they're not, technically they are Lint neighborhood, live in that catchment. But I think it makes more common sense for them to continue on with that cohort. So I just wanted to put that out there.
Thank you. We've captured that too.
I think in G2 that might even work from a numbers standpoint, but yeah.
And there's agreement in the chat. Jonathan asks, will students currently enrolled at schools be allowed to stay through the final grade? And will siblings be allowed to join, provided their older sibling is still enrolled? That's a Margaret question.
Actually, a board. Oh, go ahead, Margaret.
No, you go ahead, Megan.
I was going to say that is something that we do not have finalized. That's something that we will have to bring to the board, and they have to make that decision because it is a policy decision. And I think when we do bring that to the board, we will give them we will ask for the options like to expedite or to go through their policy, but that is a board decision. We can't state that right now. We can give them a recommendation, and Claire would put that in the recommendation.
Do you mean enrolled, stay at all the way through 5th grade or 8th grade? Is that what you mean? If they're
there's like a legacy policy and like multiple policies on that. And so, but that's because there is a policy. If we want to do anything and expedite or stay with that policy, that is a board decision that would have to be made by them if we wanted to go different than the policy. And I can't quote policy, so I apologize.
Yeah. And I think, thank you, Megan, for that. And I think that I've heard Claire a number of times say that if there is a recommendation that comes from the group about how best to do the transition, that should be stated. Like if that should, I think that was part of it, but and to Megan's point is that becomes a recommendation to the board that would require board action.
So we have just about 4 minutes left. Are there any thoughts, anything else standing out to you? If you had to choose one over the other, do you know what you would choose? And if you don't, is there anything that would make it more clear? And would you like to see a different slide? Yes, Jonathan, you know which one?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would choose G1. It seems to have, I understand that we want to have utilization there's a minimum, right? Because that below that, you start to get different complications than you get when a school is overutilized, but that there's the best balance, right? There's only one school over 80% utilization in G1, but there are multiple schools over 80% in G2, but then also some approaching 80%. So it seems like it's more evenly spread in G1.
Does anyone have any really strong feelings? We have about 1 minute left. Is there anything you want to make sure is spoken before we go and make the choice between the two? How do you feel about, oh, please go.
Sorry, Marnie. I just wanted to re-clarify again that like we are looking at G1 and G2 and also thinking of any amendments and how that would work, but also that the next time we meet, it's F3 and G. So when we're thinking and processing, that we really think about, you know, centering our ResJ, racial equity, social justice, keeping Black and Native students that are in our vision and our strategic plan of making sure that we're always keeping that at the center of our thought process. And I know that sometimes the numbers are hard to get away from and the boundaries and the lines, but really just making sure that we center all of our decisions and our thought process on our Black and Native students and that historically underserved. And that, you know, we have 3 weeks to really process through this, and there's still time to really dig deep into this and look at how we can look at all of these options given this additional time to make the best decisions that we can in the amount of time we have.
Well said. So we're going to go back to the big room and take a break, I believe.
Appreciate everybody's thoughtfulness and really wrestling with the trade-offs. So appreciate the thinking so much.